Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I have a special guest, Michelle Catlin. We came to discuss The End of History or The Clash of Civilization by Francis Fukuyama or Samuel Hunt or the late Samuel P. Huntington. So how are you, Michelle?
I'm doing fine. It's a bit late here right now, but it's the weekend, so I'm usually up this late. So I'm just glad that I got the time to have this stream because it is an interesting subject to discuss.
Yeah. So so what what do you have you read The Clash of Civilization by Samuel Huntington? Or
Yeah,
you got a good idea of it?
I have read read both End of History and Clash of Civilizations, but it has been a while ago, so I I don't remember every detail of the books, but I do have a rough understanding of what the ideas are in the books.
Yeah. So, like once when we streamed the very first time, you kind of brought up the end. You think that liberal democracy is not the end of history, or it's not the final stage of our evolution or the evolution of governments. Like you disagree with that narrative. Like, can you explain that reasons again?
Yeah, I do have multiple reasons to reject the idea that liberalism is going to be the end of history, or at least the system of liberal democracy. Um, for once, I do think that no political system or civilizations are really permanent. I think history and civilizations kind of move in a cycle uh, rather than a linear progressive way. So I do think that every historical period kind of has an end, beginning point and end point, kind of like a life cycle. So I think that liberalism is simply one of those cycles. And I also think that liberal democracy, when you actually compare it to the historical scope of systems that humanity has made, I think liberal democracy is still relatively young and very short still. Even in terms of like how many countries have adopted it. Um, Most countries have adopted liberal democracy since the past century. There have been very few countries that have embraced democracy before that. A few examples would be America or the Netherlands, but most countries, even back in the 20th century, were still empires and still had a rather autocratic system. So I do think liberalism would have to kind of prove itself to be able to stand the test of time. And I'm also very skeptical of the idea that liberal democracy can be universalized and applied to certain civilizations beyond the West. But I can kind of go into more specific on that as we go through the discussion.
Just I so lately, well, actually, over time, Francis Fukuyama has become my favorite political scientist because he sort of helped refine my understanding on political development, how states formed, and I disagree that the fact that if you read the since I'm more interested when I read the end of history and the last span, I'm more interested about what could have gone wrong with liberal democracy, and he was able to explain it pretty well in his book. I think that's what people miss with Fukuyama, that he sort of had a really pessimistic outlook about the end of history. It wasn't supposed to be a noble period for humanity. You know, I feel like people miss out that um, aspect.
I think that is certainly a possible interpretation. I think a lot of people who have kind of embraced this end of history narrative and who may have kind of been inspired by Fukuyama do tend to be very optimistic people and very optimistic about the future, compared to someone like Fukuyama who was more pessimistic. For example, Steven Pinker would be someone who is pretty much well known for being very optimistic about the progression of humanity and what liberal democracy can kind of mean in terms of that. And I think a lot of people in the a lot of figures in the so-called intellectual dark web kind of take this human progress approach to liberal democracy. So I think the concept of end of history liberalism has kind of gone beyond Fukuyama's initial ideas to kind of have become more of a more of an optimistic ideology.
Yeah. Just with Samuel Huntington thesis. Actually, I you may not like this, but actually come to view that the clash of civilization and the end of history are not opposed to one another as it appears on the surface, but it's to me they're really making the same argument about what is the ultimate threat to liberal democracy at the end of the day. Like you have the reason why I think Clash of Civilization is a much more significant book is that it was able to foresaw the upcoming conflicts to the 21st century. And reason why end of history is sort of the line because it's supposed to be this this period, but in the end, they're still covering what is the threats to democracy, what's the threat to liberalism, what's the threat to the rest. I think Huntington was making a more external argument while Fukuyama was making a more eternal argument because it's really covering what are the threats existentially or externally or
Yeah, I can see that. I also think one fundamental difference between the ideas of Huntington and Fukuyama is um, in terms of how compatible is liberalism on a global scale. I think Fukuyama did believe in the idea that ultimately democracy would stand the test of time and kind of um, become the Hegelian end system, mainly for kind of in there are some pragmatic reasons for people to think this. For example, the theory that democracy leads to peace amongst allies of democratic nations. So, democratic nations inherently kind of have an advantage when it comes to surviving due to being more peaceful. Um, but Huntington really seemed to kind of reject this idea that, for example, Chinese civilization or Islamic civilization could kind of embrace the liberal democracy that the West pushes. And for Huntington, it really seemed more about protecting liberal values within the context of Western culture compared to preserving liberal values by enforcing it on a global scale. And I think that is the kind of the two main disagreements. How compatible is would liberal democracy be among cultures that kind of collide with Western ideology?
right. I think I think in the long run, it's since America is the leading superpower and they kind of always want to build representative governments all over the world, have stable governments all over the world. But even now, we kind of see democracies across the globe receding. As Larry Diamond put it, a democratic recession. We saw the most famous example would be Russia, where they actually tried to liberalize, but quickly fall back to authoritarianism. And China also posed a sizable challenge to Fukuyama's thesis to that the rise of China is going to be a really significant event if they, you know, get their stuff together. It's
Yeah, I think the biggest issue with Western civilization is that it has this assumption that the cultural values that we hold and the kind of political views that we hold are this kind of universal natural rights, as if it's kind of um, morally self-evident to have these liberal values, and that it is merely a matter of progression until other civilizations kind of wise up and also embrace these principles. And the idea of kind of a American global police is to kind of push nations towards that tendency, so that America, has more allies and it's in better in the interest of America. But I think the problem with this mentality is that it's, well, for one, I don't believe that these are universal principles. I think these are cultural principles rooted in Western civilization. So when I see these ideas being universalized, I think it diminishes the cultural value that these ideas have for the West. So while we are kind of diminishing our own cultural standing among the world, we are seeing places like China, places like Russia, and the Islamic states, and even to an extent South America and Africa. These are all regions um, that are only strengthening their own cultural values since the collapse of the Soviet Union. They are more emphasizing their own regional strength, their own cultural strength, and building up from those values. And that's something that the West is just not doing. It's doing the opposite. Our elites are very much determined to show a very strong hatred towards the West, while they embrace ideologies like multiculturalism, cosmopolitanism, and being a world citizen, so to speak. So I think the biggest challenge of the West is how can we engage with um, opposing civilizations that are only strengthening their own identity while we are continuing to lose ours.
yeah. Also, have you ever seen those sovereign citizens videos on YouTube? Like, you ever seen them?
I haven't, I think.
You should see them if you really want to have a good laugh in the next couple hours.
What's it about?
Oh right. Oh, it's just basically like the police basically turn pull over these people and they claim that they're citizens of the world and the police are get so irritated. Like it's really funny. Just like these people claim that hey, we're citizens of the world. Um, I don't have a driver's license, but um, but I don't have to. I don't need to have one because I'm the citizen of the world and I'm a sovereign citizen, so you can't arrest me. Universal rights applies to everyone. So it's really stupid. It's hilarious. You should watch that. But anyway,
Yeah, that's kind of the it's kind of the logical conclusion of the whole world citizen mentality. When you don't accept, the legitimacy of borders, for example, why would you even accept the legitimacy of any lawful constitution or legal system? Because those are all artificial constructs built for so-called artificial nations. So it sounds ridiculous, but that is kind of the mentality that the world citizen people are moving to.
yeah, it's it's kind of it's kind of sad that that most European, well, not sure about European nations, but at least in America, that our institutions have taken a therapeutic turn, coddling the mind, so to speak. Just you know,
Yeah,
and
I also I do have kind of a theory why America specifically is very into this idea of global citizenship and less of a focus on heritage and culture, and I think it's mainly because America is the kind of the economic hub of the world. So you see, of course, a lot of migration to America, not just from Latin-speaking countries, but also from Europe and all over the world. And people who migrate to another country for economic reasons whatsoever, those are people who tend to have less attachment to a nation. So what you see is people who are more, you could call it individualist or more globalist, more who have less of a cultural attachment to a nation. They're selecting themselves out of certain countries and moving towards, economic global centers. So, for example, there was a study done on this on Scandinavian countries, specifically Norway, I believe. And what you were seeing is that people who were more likely to hold individualist views were all immigrating to America, well, whereas those that have more collectivist views, more nationalist views, or also even some socialist views, tend to stay. So the individualists are moving all to America, which causes, of course, a more individualist, pluralistic mentality there, whereas the European countries are only becoming more collectivist and more culturally attached to the nation. And that is also a possible theory why nationalist movements in Europe have grown so much in the 21st century, whereas America is only kind of getting more divided and fragmented culturally.
It's maybe there's always been that way since the early colonial days. The When America was a colony, because you always this is to say that America was always sort of have this pluralist mentality that not everyone was the Anglo Protestant. It was a very diverse nation before diversity became our strength, rhetoric took over. But then again, you also sort of have this mentality that if you're going to be American, you should be fully assimilated to the American. You must learn the English language. You must learn how to talk properly. You need to almost forgo your culture and assimilate to the American culture. But since let's say the 1970s, we kind of had this shift to this more pluralist, multicultural attitude that legislation was not making a requirement to learn English. You have legislation pushing forward that you must learn a second language like Spanish, and this is kind of led to this delegitimization that we are seeing right now of the nation state, at least in this country.
Yeah, and to kind of give my opinion on, of course, it's kind of the whole melting pot versus the multicultural salad bowl analogies, of course. And I think my personal take on that is that I think the whole assimilated melting pot mentality of America could only really work because there is a notable, you could call it ethnic majority in the US that kind of um, dominates the culture and language. So you have English as the language. You have mostly um, Europe people from European ancestry, mostly English and German people. You of course have very Protestant religious base on America, and of course the I do think a lot of the um, constitutionalist and liberal ideas in America is very much built on an Anglo-Protestant foundation. So I think if you want to have a nation that can assimilate people into a host culture, then um, you need a predominant culture and people to inhabit that. When you don't have that, when other cultures and groups are um, becoming bigger and in size and bigger in numbers, and they gain ground in terms of culture and language, then we are going to see an internal clash in the country for which culture wants to be dominant. Because I don't believe that cultures can coexist together in a close proximity. I think there will always be a dominant culture, and that once there is a dominant culture, then people can assimilate. But once there are multiple cultures with a relatively equal size, then there are going to be cultural clashes. That's why I think it's mainly due to the Immigration Act of 1965 that led to a extreme surge of Hispanic immigration, which has also led to a big enough ethnic group to enforce a different culture into the US that kind of challenges the idea of the melting pot. I think Samuel Huntington also kind of predicted this in his book, The Clash of Civilizations.
He explored it a bit further in his last book, um, Who Are We? Questions of America, National Identity, and which is actually a really good book. But and more recently, Fukuyama also released a book called Identity, the politics of the demand for dignity and the politics of resentment. It's actually a pretty good book, but it also explores the questions of identity. That one of his fundamental conclusions that Western democratic nations should base their identities on their constitutions or civic nations. I mean, on the idea of civic identity than let's say on race or something. Yeah, pretty much that. That's one of his fundamental conclusions to fix that problem, that we should have credo nations like America. America can define itself as a credo nation. He also criticized the US Constitution and Declaration of Independence for not really defining American identity. And that's he see that as one of the problems with America, one of the weaknesses of America as of right now. That the lack of identity is also a problem too.
Yeah, definitely. I think that is the um, fundamental problem because America, it has always had a America has always kind of been defined by different groups who migrated there and who colonized America to would kind of um, um, create regional cultures within the US. That's why I also sometimes think that America would be better off if it balkanized. But I think due to the amount of regional cultures and having a I think that makes it very difficult for America to have a unified identity, and that's why I've always found American identity to be very weird, in my opinion, because it's like you said, it's more
Yeah,
well.
it's just
There was this recent interview or speech by Charlie Kirk, and he described America not as being based on the land or the people or where it's located or the geography or the specific groups, but the idea. To Charlie Kirk, America is an idea. It is an abstract idea, and as long as that idea will exist, America will exist. And that kind of abstract thinking is something that seems to it does seem to kind of define what American identity is. Um, it is a very civic, exceptional identity um, that isn't attached to a specific people or specific geography, and that makes it very different from a nation like Germany or England, for example. And I think that is why America is kind of struggling with its identity because I don't think you can really build a unified identity of different regional cultures with only kind of an abstract idea. I think you need a well-defined shell of um, you need a well-defined shell of, to an extent, the people, the heritage, and the culture does matter in terms of building a full-fledged identity. I think you can't really define it purely as a thought experiment, so to say.
What do you think? What let's see. What do you think's gonna happen in Europe since there's been a backlash to the migration crisis? What do you think's what's the future hold for them for you guys anyway?
It's very difficult to tell what's going to happen because what we are seeing is an unprecedented amount of support for nationalist parties. Even 10 years ago, all these parties that are now becoming the biggest in elections um, are they were fringe back at the time. Many of them not even really represented in government. So there has been an unprecedented surge of nationalism in Europe, which I think is to an extent the product of failed of the refugee crisis, which was an absolute failure. Um, I think it is also a backlash to the constant demand for multiculturalism, but also, as I talked before, in terms of the whole migration theory that individualists move out of Europe to economic hubs like America. I think is also a reason why these nationalist parties are searching, because Europe is becoming more collectivist, I think. And I think I think what's really going to determine it is how mainstream parties are going to react to this, or what the nationalist parties will do once in power. Because I do think a large part of the support for nationalists depends very much on kind of a backlash against failed immigration policy. So, for example, in the in 2015, 2016, we had the refugee crisis, and it was just very catastrophic. It was very rushed. Politicians didn't really know what they were doing, and that caused such a backlash that I think it really caused a surge of nationalism during that period. I also think that is one of the those are one of the biggest reasons why Trump and Brexit won, for example, back in 2016. But ever since the East European countries have kind of closed down the borders there, the refugee flow has stopped into Europe. So um, that also has kind of caused nationalism to be mitigated. So it's a very um, it's a very weird relationship basically there in terms of how Europe goes, because basically the strength of nationalist parties very much depends on how strong immigration into Europe is. So either either we are going to see much more stricter immigration policies, which causes the flow to stop, but it also kind of causes nationalism to decline again because people don't really have to worry about immigration anymore. Or the refugee crisis is just going to keep escalating, more immigration is going to come, and that is just going to cause more nationalism, and that is going to cause just a lot of conflict, I think. So I think the future of Europe is very uncertain, but I do think that we are kind of at the crossroads right now, because we are seeing a very big surge in population in Africa, for example, especially in countries like Nigeria. The populations are expected to quadruple, and at some point, if the population of Africa is now 4 times the size of now, and all of those people want to go to Europe, then we really need to have a proper conversation of, is this what we want? Is this going to be for the best for Europe? And I think then things are things could get very nasty, possibly, but it's all kind of going to depend on how European countries are going to act now on immigration before the population boom really starts to escalate.
No, now there's a proxy war in Libya that the French or Italians are fighting each other, sort of. It's more so that French wants to restore their sphere of influence in West Africa, and the Italian government wants to prevent more immigration from that Pacific region of Africa to their country because Italy was kind of hit the hardest. Well, not from that refugee crisis, from just the immigration from Africa.
Yeah, the flow from North Africa, of course, because they're directly to the north of North Africa. So
Yeah,
of course they are going to be hit very hard for migration. And of course, I think Italy was really, it was kind of inevitable for Italy to really be the first to become very explicitly nationalist again, in terms of how successful their current nationalist party, Lega Nord, is doing. Right now, Lega Nord if there were new elections, the nationalist party Lega Nord would win by a landslide, about over 30%, which is a lot for a multi-party system. So, and it was kind of inevitable for Italy to go that route because they're probably, with the exception of Greece, probably have been the biggest losers in a era dominated by neoliberal globalism, in terms of how their economy is doing. The eurozone has just hit them terribly. The unemployment level is just sky high, and they've always kind of been undermined by more northwestern countries like Germany and England. So I think, yeah, I think Italy has always been kind of less attached to a lot of the values that northwestern countries hold, and to have it be constantly pushed on them, I think has led to this backlash. And right now, what we are seeing with the administration is also that they are planning to create a parallel currency, parallel to the euro. They are to kind of give people the option for an independent currency. And I'm very interested in seeing how that is going to work out. So yeah, I think Italy has just been hit the hardest in terms of globalist policies, whether it's just the economy in general or just migration. So it's very interesting to see um, how that revolt is going to kind of clash with the other G7 nations.
just how's your country affected by this? You live in the Netherlands, right? How is it Eurosceptic or pro EU?
It is mostly pro EU, in comparison to more southern and eastern countries. Well, not eastern, because a lot of eastern countries rely on subsidies from the EU, but places like Italy and Greece that are very Eurosceptic. The Netherlands is, in comparison, a lot more pro EU. We do have a couple of notable Eurosceptic parties, like Forum for Democracy, which has become the biggest in the Dutch Senate, and as well as the PVV, which has always been kind of the main nationalist party in the Netherlands. So there is a very clear demand for Euroscepticism, but a lot of it is um, soft Euroscepticism. So it's not necessarily that people don't really want to leave the EU here, but they don't want to have a European army, for example, or a European superstate. They want to scale back the EU. They want to reform the EU. They don't want to go as far as, say, Germany or the current French president do in terms of integration, but they also don't really want to leave. And I think that is mainly because the Netherlands is a nation that has been always defined by trade and exports. So I think um, if I think a lot of people here are worried, what would happen if the Netherlands were to leave such a big economic union.
Just, man. You make it seem like everything from the 1980s onwards or the post Cold War era was a mistake, to be honest.
Yeah, well, I think um, I think the 19th and early 2000s really were a an era of globalism. It really was like all about the trades, all about peace, world peace, all about being a world citizen. People like um, just the whole mentality of globalization became mainstream in the 80s and 90s, and I think ever since 9/11 and the 2008 financial crisis and the current refugee crisis, I think ever more and more we are seeing the cracks in globalism, in neoliberalism. It's kind of a slow um, machine showing its cracks and showing its weakness. And I think now we are in a period where I think there is kind of a clash of where we want to go now in the future. Are we going to have a globe that is defined by, nation states? Um, is it defined by cultural clashes? Is it defined by people asserting their own identity, or is it going to be a globe that is defined by this end of history liberalism? Is it going to be defined by globalism? Is it going to be defined by pure international trade? I think we are really at a crossroad in regards of that right now. I still think globalism is kind of a dominant force in terms of economics and terms of in terms of the power that they have, the soft power that they hold over um, various institutions. But I do think we are seeing cracks. Um, I think I think people are just aren't confident that this system is going to be a system that is going to last a century. I think we really I think we it's not necessarily that we that's it's kind of a one-on-one battle right now that this is the moment where globalism can either win or lose. I think that is a bit more in the future, but we are seeing the early signs of it. I think we are seeing the signs where globalism is showing its weakness and where we can see alternative ideas challenge it in the future.
Yes. Globalization and this discontent, huh? Fine. Finding the problems of the 21st century and the clash of civilizations was able to the book go back to the main topic, the book Huntington's book, The Clash of Civilization, where the main thesis is about to outline the upcoming conflicts. And I think one of the points that he raised that we're going to see like just more like one more hardline realpolitik, I think. Like more hardline, hard power than soft power in the 21st century again, due to the fact that there's going to be more frequent cultural classes. While Fukuyama almost neglected um, the research, almost neglected a resurgent Russia or a rising China. He almost neglected that in the end of history. It just it's just sort of just interesting how things will unfold in the next 30 years in our lifetime. But
Oh, oh,
but
definitely.
but I think America is actually going to be fine. To be honest, I think Europe and the rest of the world is kind of screwed.
Oh, well, that's nice. But yeah, I do think America has a lot of staying power. I don't think it's doomed to
Oh,
Um,
don't worry. The Netherlands will do fine too. Just the other country that surrounds your nation won't do so fine. Go Netherlands. You know.
well, that's at least nice. But
Also, I think
I
they're going to win the World Cup in a couple of years too. So yeah.
I do think that America, a lot of people are very pessimistic about America. They think, China and Russia are going to rule over them. They're going to overtake them.
Oh no,
Um,
no. I think
but
America is going to return to isolationism. It's going
yeah,
to do that territories.
I think, when you look at just how much, just the insane amount of bureaucracy and economic power that America holds, they can pretty much tank anything. I think. Well, not everything, of course, but they can tank a whole lot. I think if there were, for example, a another Great Depression, I don't think that would be the end of the America. I think America would have certain, economic tools to reverse that pretty quickly. I think simply the structures that America have are structures that other countries simply don't have. The power of, for example, just the Federal Reserve, for example, the power that America has over that system alone gives it a lot more power than a country like China or Russia or India, for example, even if they were to beat the US in GDP, for example.
I think you have to revoke your libertarian card because you just defended the Federal Reserve.
Oh well, I didn't defend it for
Well,
necessarily.
you mentioned it being a positive force for power in the United States, so you kind of have to revoke it. I'm sorry, I don't make the
Well,
rules. I
well, I don't really
it's not
consider
good.
myself a libertarian anyway anymore. So, but what I meant with the Federal Reserve, it's more of a neutral statement that simply that the U.S. and it was just, for example, just an example, just the amount of tools that the U.S. has, that the government has to hold their grip on the global stage is something that I think other countries simply don't have. I don't think Russia or China or India have really the equivalent of a Federal Reserve that can kind of alter the course of a depression, for example.
Just the Chinese financial structure is predicated on it's let's just say it's extremely weak and is really predatory in its finances. And the Russian financial structure is also extremely weak. The ruble is very weak as a currency, so they can't stand high inflation. Their currency is currently being destroyed by inflation.
Yeah, I've always found the scaremongering about Russia to be rather weird because Russia is by no means a global power to the extent of, say, China or India or America or even a place like Germany, for example. When you actually look at the military and economic structures of Russia, it's much more comparable to an average European country. So I've always kind of found it weird that Russia is always kind of picked as this threat, whereas I don't really see it as anything more than a kind of a middle power in comparison to, say, my country, for example. Um, but I think this obsession with Russia is really just kind of a remnant of Cold War thinking. I think that's kind of the mentality, maybe.
Oh, lucky for us. Lucky for you. Well, not lucky for us. Well, not lucky for everyone else. The world is not ready for a Cold War II, Part Two with China. At least not yet, anyway. Sort of. Not really. America's not as uniform like back in the 1940s, which is kind of sad.
Yeah, it's I I I just find this whole idea of Um, this Cold War too, and the threat that Russia poses, I think it's just so completely overblown. And I also think that war is going to be less and less about. It's going to be less about guns and military and direct force, and I think it is going to be much more defined by economic sanctions as well as cybersecurity. So I think the countries that you really need to look at and really need to prepare for are the countries that are going to. I think that there are two factors really that are going to define how powerful a nation is going to be in the future, and that is, for one, how well they are in cybersecurity, how advanced they are in terms of that, but also how advanced they are in terms of like gene editing and CRISPR tech. I think that is also going to be a huge factor in the future because um, you know gene editing can really alter how a nation is going to behave in terms of crime and intelligence and things like that. If a country can really manage to advance in that regard, I think that is going to, reflect in the overall well-being and power of a nation. I think in terms of that, China has really, in both of those cases, has really done a much better job at advancing than Western nations. I think.
Do you think it will lead to a more peaceful world?
I don't think it's going to lead to a more peaceful world. No. Well, it depends on what you mean by peace, of course. I think.
I mean by peace that there's not going to be a other World War II or other World War One.
Yeah, I think there is going to be a lot less dead people. That is at least good, of course, because at that point, war is going to send out, thousands of soldiers to war, and to other countries. That is going to be such a waste of manpower and costs. Where well, you can simply, hit a country with sanctions and kind of watch it crumble, or just attack their technological infrastructure. But I do think economic sanctions and cybersecurity can still affect people in a way that could cost them their lives. We've seen what the economic sanctions did in Iraq, for example. So there are still ways in for these kind of passive wars to cause casualties, but I don't think it will ever really get to the level anymore of the two big world wars.
So, you ever read Square and the Tower by British historian Neil Ferguson? It's a
Uh, I don't think I have, no, but I am familiar with Ferguson.
yeah. He um is a pretty good book. It goes over the complexities of networks and hierarchies throughout history, and he somewhat believes that, and I quote, the pervasiveness of network communications in social, financial, industrial, and military sectors has revolutionized mobilities, outpacing most rules, regulations, and the technical comprehension of many regulators. It has, in some respects, created a state of nature that escaped from which, according to Hobbes, provided the motivating force creating a political order. Asymmetric and a kind of congenial world disorder are built into relations between cyber powers, both in diplomacy and in strategy, absent articulation of some rules or rules of international conduct. A crisis will arise from the inner dynamics of the system. Yes. Yeah, you get that? Mhm.
Could you kind of simplify it?
The technology, pretty instant communication and technology has revolutionized the rules and conduct of international affairs and how world powers interact, and it provided escape from the Hobbesian notion of the state of nature that life will be short, brutish, and short.
Yeah, I do think that makes sense. Social media, for example, or just internet in general, has just connected people in such a massive way that it was kind of inevitable that you would have kind of a that you would kind of have a globe that is built around international ideas. So I think technology has definitely kind of accelerated kind of an interconnectedness among humanity.
I like the fact that we kind of just evolved just talking about global politics, although Huntington and Fukuyama also talk about global politics, sort of.
Yeah, well, the end of history and clash of civilizations were all about global politics.
Yeah, just the eternal, the external. Fortunately, we're seeing the eternal decline of civil society, which just kind of sucks. It's this mentality, this delegitimization that things have really gone more polarized and really absurd for the last 30 years.
It has definitely become absurd and, of course, very polarized. What I do find very interesting is that you have people who, on the one hand, they say two things. They say how great it is that America has become so diverse and that Europe has become so diverse and that we've never been more multicultural and there's never been more diversity. But at the same time, these same people will say there has never been more division, it has never been more polarized, we've never seen more differences between people to the point where people are actually fearing a civil war too in America. And sometimes you have to kind of ask these people that maybe the whole diversity thing and the we are more divided than ever thing are maybe possibly related to each other. Just a thought.
Yes, yes. Strange times we're living in, and that's supposed to be a curse too.
Well, I will say this at least. It has made politics a lot more entertaining.
Well, I think British Parliament was always entertaining before we got into clown world. Well, British Parliament debating's always been entertaining.
Yeah, of course. That's always kind of been a mainstay of the English. They are always very entertaining in how they conduct themselves.
Just like like you get so energized when you hear these politicians debate so passionately. It's just like you just want to scream, yeah. Yeah. And while America is more like our pundits do a lot of debating, while the politicians tend to just be in the back room, just making backroom deal, just just boring bureaucratic stuff.
Yeah, it seems that British Parliament is a lot less formal compared to a lot of other parliaments. You will see a lot more shouting and cheering and booing in British parliaments compared to a place like the American House or Senate.
Yes, it's a bit more just formal, uptight, and a lot of these people probably don't want to be there. Just want to get their agenda fulfilled as quickly as possible. That's why LC is probably going to be the most successful politician in my lifetime.
Who?
Uh, Alexander Ocasio Cortez.
Oh yeah, yeah. I think because America has always been very formal. I think that's why a lot of more colorful personalities, are sticking more out. I think we are really going into a politics that is all about personality, and that you can see that with Donald Trump, but you can also see that with AOC, for example, who I think say what you want about her views, but she has really done a good job at capturing people and capturing the audience in terms of how she presents herself. It has made her very polarized, but it also has made her a very notable politician.
She presents herself as a normal person, not as large. She's not larger than life as, let's say, a Charles de Gaulle, but more like a really down to earth human being.
Yeah, and you have, for example, she will make a basic error at a specific political thing, and how then you have all these conservative pundits kind of trying to make this a gotcha, like, ha, we got you now. We now know how stupid you are, but for most people, it just looks like she's just a young girl who made a very normal mistake. I think it just the more I see conservatives kind of going after AOC, the more it makes her kind of look more normal and better in comparison.
Yeah, just yeah. Is there any, since I don't really follow Dutch politics, is there any funny characters in your,
Cherry,
situation?
yeah, yeah, a very interesting character. That's also the political party that I support. His name is Cherry Baudet. Um, he's a jurist that recently became the leader of a new party. And he's been a very interesting figure who has been, he has a very interesting personality, kind of a very upper class posh personality that is just very interesting and very different compared to how uptight Dutch politicians usually are. So, a couple examples, for example, is that when he held his first speech in Dutch Parliament, he made the speech pretty much entirely in Latin. He didn't speak Dutch, but just Latin. And of course, the most people in the parliament just couldn't understand what he said because he was just speaking Latin, or he um, for example, walked into parliaments with military equipment on to kind of raise awareness of underfunding in the Dutch military. So, um, or he, for example, when he gained like three seats in Amsterdam during the local elections, he just made this whole dance routine. He's a very interesting figure if you just kind of look him up. He's also very a very philosophical figure. When he won the Dutch Senate in early March this year, he actually held a very long speech where he even quoted Friedrich Hegel. He quoted him saying that the owl of Minerva only rises at dusk, or something like that quote. But that is just very interesting because you don't see politicians quote philosophers like that normally. So yeah, he's a very interesting personality, and again, he's a very recent personality, and that is what we are seeing more and more in even just international politics. We have Donald Trump, we have AOC, but you also have Bolsonaro, we have Nigel Farage, we have
Ooh, yeah, I love that Brazilian president. I
yeah,
love
yeah, and Duterte, just a lot of people who are just a lot more rich in personality. And yeah, I think it's because of the internet, but yeah,
I just like the fact that Bolsonaro has tweeted out a Dragon Ball themed tweet or had the song from Dragon Ball, but like the original series promoting the Brazilian military.
yeah, yeah. Bolsonaro just seems like a complete nerd to me. He tweets about anime, he tweets about games. It's just very interesting just to see, the president of fucking Brazil doing that.
Good. Yes, I love that guy. He seems like an epic troll, but a really cool person to hang out with.
Yeah, also Matteo Salvini from Italy also has posted a lot of anime stuff. For example, there was this hashtag that he made for his campaign, and the hashtag was basically about how every time something happens, then Salvini gets blamed for it. And he made a hashtag about blame Salvini. And in one of those memes that he posted, it was also about Dragon Ball Z, and that is what and it was like Krillin gets killed and again blame Salvini.
And it's amazing how Dragon Ball has really became a global phenomenon.
Yeah, yeah, it's very interesting how that went.
Are you a
I'm not,
big fan of Dragon Ball or just like a casual viewer?
um, I'm not really. I did watch it a bit as a kid, and as a kid, I've found it very. I found it very interesting to watch. But I don't really have the nostalgia that other people do. And I do find Dragon Ball Z in terms of battle anime to be a bit more generic in terms of their powers, how it's always
Well,
kind of like
they actually started everything. What's everything is generic with battle anime started with them.
yeah, in Dragon Ball Z's defense, it was the original, so you can't really say that it's generic when it's invented the whole thing.
Like everything, everything that got started in shonen manga, battle manga, can trace back to Dragon Ball in the modern era. Like every popular shonen manga artists and storytellers say, hey, they've been fans of Dragon Ball. Like the creator of Naruto and One Piece said they were fans of Dragon Ball. Like was influenced by it.
Yeah, the influence is very undeniable. But I do feel like that a lot of the concepts of Dragon Ball hasn't really dated well, and that especially is something that I saw in Dragon Ball Super, which was a lot more modern, and it kind of still kept the old Dragon Ball formula of simple laser beam powers and transformations, and I think that's kind of gets a bit generic.
Yeah, they just don't have. I don't think they have good. Um, I don't think they have a good story direction, like at least in the Z portion or just the original Z portion. You actually have like a interesting but simple plot going on. That you have more character development. Like there was much higher stakes, but now, hey, if someone dies, wish them back with Dragon Ball. If someone dies, like there's no that those stakes kind of just diminish.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a bit. It depends kind of a bit on how what you kind of expect out of a anime. Do you want an anime with very detailed stories and very diverse character powers and battles that are more mental, or do you just want a lot of strong guys beating the shit out of each other? And if it's the latter, then just going to enjoy Dragon Ball Z because it's just people beating the shit out of each other, and it's entertaining if that's kind of what you're into. Sometimes because sometimes I just kind of want to watch something that is kind of brainless. You just want to watch something that is fun and entertaining, and Dragon Ball Z or Dragon Ball Super is exactly kind of that series.
Also, speaking of anime, I know you don't really like the One Punch Man season two, just due to the fact that animation is not up to par in the first season 5 years ago, or was it 5 years ago? Man, I feel like it's been
It aired in 2015,
so.
so it was late 2015. So I think it's just less than 5 years ago.
Yeah. Just what's your problem with season two? Because the story seems to be heating up more recently.
Yeah, it's. I do think the story is a lot more interesting than season one. But I read the manga of One Punch Man, so it's of course an adaptation of that. So I kind of judge it because I've already kind of read the manga. I judge the second season more on the animation more than I do the storyline because I'm already kind of familiar with the story. And I wouldn't say that One Punch Man season 2 is bad in terms of animation. There were some moments that I do think were a bit weird, but I don't think it's bad. I mean, if you compare this to the average anime, this is still really on par as a solid anime. But the animation of One Punch Man season one was just on a whole nother level, and trying to capture that again in a second season with a completely different staff was, of course, kind of going to be impossible. So I'm not I'm not really disappointed with season two or think that it's a bad anime necessarily, but I do think it is a step down compared to just the masterpiece that season one was in terms of animation.
You know.
And
Okay,
it,
okay. Well, one more sidebar. Right. I like to say you're wrong on Avengers Endgame. Is a bit of a mess, but I just like to know, like, you're wrong. You have a wrong opinion on that.
okay, I
Uh,
mean we can agree
But
to disagree.
but seriously though, like, yeah, Avengers Endgame has a bit more of a messier plot, but it's really a series of great character moments. That's what made the film great. It has a great series of character moments and fulfillment of really great character arcs. That makes Avengers Endgame a decent piece of film, in my opinion.
I do think there were a lot of touching moments in Endgame. For being back with his mother. Iron Man. A lot of spoilers right now, but just the whole beginning and ending of Iron Man, Hawkeye. Losing his family and then wanting to get them back. How there were a lot of like you said, there were a lot of great character dynamics and a lot of great character moments that I think did kind of shine in the movie, which I also like because superhero movies often kind of play it safe, and I think they did experiment a lot more in this movie. But I think overall, in terms of what I just find weird with Endgame is that the despite the fact that it's longer and that it has a lot less characters to deal with compared to Infinity Wars, it just feels like there were a lot of more cut corners. I think in terms of just how the whole pacing and story went, and the whole time travel thing. Um, I yeah I don't really feel the same. Um, I don't really feel the same. How do you put it?
Uh,
Unity that Infinity War had. Infinity War really felt like this big ongoing battle with all the characters that we've seen from the past 10 years of movies, coming together, stopping this one guy. And it's just the pacing of it was just so great. And I missed that in Endgame. I felt like Infinity War felt much more like a finale compared to Endgame.
mhm. That's fair.
I kind of like how this went from history and civilizations to anime and movies.
Hey, this is peak political. This is a peak political live stream. We
This
still
is
talking about other nonsense. So yeah, we're still keeping to the general theme here.
Yeah. I mean,
Also, not to mention, we're still talking about culture exchanges, like anime becoming more popular in recent years.
yeah, that's true. I will say that's one of the things about globalizations that I do like. The fact that we get anime.
Let just let's see. We talked about. Actually, we didn't really talk about. Do you remember that Huntington somewhat described the differences between the Sino, the Rush? the Sino, the Orthodox, and the Western civilization. Like, you want to talk about that a little bit there?
Yeah, the different types of civilizations.
Like, how would you describe the Russian civilization or the Orthodox civilization, which sort of includes Eastern Europe?
Yeah, I've kind of been thinking about what how many civilizations are really in the world, and in terms of major civilizations, I think there's Western civilization, which is the U.S., Europe, and kind of the Commonwealth. There's the Orthodox civilization, as I would call it, which includes most of Eastern Europe, except Albania and Azerbaijan, and of course Russia. That kind of is the Orthodox civilization, which is kind of it has kind of the same roots as Western civilization, but it misses the um, Catholic and Protestant influences, which is why it's Orthodox. Um, then in then in terms of Cynic civilization, Huntington argued that Japan was distinct from Cynic civilization. He called it Japonic civilization. I kind of disagree with that. I think Japan is still would still be part of Cynic civilization because in terms of how their rituals are, their holidays, and kind of the overall um, overall culture around it, while it has distinct ideas, I think it is still kind of part of a broader East Asian civilization.
I think
Um,
I think our Japanese accelerationist friend will disagree with you on there.
yeah, I do. Yeah, she actually did disagree on me on it back when I made a tweet about it. So, but I do think, yeah, I think of course Japan is culturally different from China in the same way that Germany is different from America. But when we look at a very broad idea of their fundamental moralities, I do think that they would constitute a whole civilization.
Oh,
And of course,
I think I'll
um,
agree with Ray and Huntington that Japanese that the Japanese do have a more distinct identity, a more distinct identity to the Sino or the Chinese civilization because they do have I think they have a different understanding of morality and traditions than the Japanese for the Japanese.
though I think their their religious and moral systems are very similar, but Japan does, of course, have a
And
distinct. Japan does have a pretty distinct system in Shinto. So,
plus
but
also the fact that they develop and just the fact they adapted European style governments when what's his name? It doesn't matter what his name is, but who? Yeah, like I can't say that word. The Meiji Revolution. They sort of just established this constitutionalism style government, this almost German style, not German style, but this English style government, while Chinese just kept to their isolationism. Like they overall got more fragment by the early 20th century. Um, like they never really had like a official rule of law. It's more like like the mandate of heaven. Like the if you do what the emperor says, like their law starts with their emperor. Emperor, in other words, is more like a rule by law country. That the law doesn't check the power and authority. The law itself is the authority. I think that's the distinction that the Chinese and Japanese has. Um,
I think that can be true to an extent. But you can also kind of you can still see kind of this kind of a autocratic mentality kind of seeping through the party system of Japan, for example, because in Japan there is still kind of one dominant party, and which has been dominant for most of the system of Japan, and that is the at least in the post World War II era, and that is the Liberal Democratic Party, which is actually a right wing party. So but what you can see is, and you also see this kind of in Singapore, this system where you have a Western style multi party democracy, for example, but you still see that East Asian element of a kind of a central authority that holds most of the power. So I find it very interesting that a lot of these East Asian countries kind of blend um, Western and Eastern ideas together.
No. Yeah, they sort of discarded the military rise, the Japanese in favor of the German model because the Anglo are kind of sucky, like using land power, you know? Yes, that's why that interesting. Can I recommend you a book? It's called The Wealth and Poverty of Nations by David Landes. You like it?
I think I've heard of that book, but then again, a lot of books have the terms wealth and nations in it, so I
Yeah.
should check it out.
Let's see,
But to
The
come,
Wealth of Nations, the wealth, and too many wealth of nations.
yeah, because I was thinking of a book called Wealth of Nations. That's a different one.
Adam Smith or something else.
Oh yeah, of course, that's it. That's, that's what I was confused by. The Wealth of
Oh, okay,
Nations.
yeah. Adam Smith also called the Chinese a stationary state. Yeah. Still is, to be honest, but you know,
Yeah, China has always been just very interesting because um, it has gone through so many different government systems, and even now it has underwent a completely cultural change due to communism, and yet still there's general the whole general mentality of a centralized, more authoritarian state has always sticked with China, even though their empires have fallen multiple times and they fragmented multiple times. It always kind of comes back to this system of centralized control, and maybe it's because China just has always had such a big population that it kind of needs such a centralized control. But it's just interesting that that it's always kind of that kind of system that comes back, whether it's an empire or a communist state.
wonder why Europe didn't have an empire again, like the Rome, something similar to the Roman Empire, just remain fragmented to this day.
Well, the I can actually kind of comment on that. The biggest reason why the Roman Empire fell was because it was too big for a central figure at the time to hold. They simply didn't have the technology at the time to overlook all these different places in Rome. And it was kind of more unofficially under Roman rule. So the whole empire system after Rome, there was an attempt with the Carolingian Empire, but it also didn't last long. So Europeans were kind of figuring out that the centralized empire system, imperial system, just wasn't a sustainable system. So what they instead made was the feudal model, where the king simply handed authority of a piece of land to a vassal. So, you have a duke and a count, and they will hold control over certain local areas, such as a duchy or a county. So, what you get is instead of a king having to manage all the land around him, instead he has a group of loyalists owning land, and in exchange for that land that they will oversee, they will hold loyalty to the king. So Europe kind of evolved their system from an inefficient imperial system for the technology at the time towards a system that was much more fitting for the technology at the time via feudalism. And when we go to the 16th century when and 17th century when technology became better and better, people were more able to um, go further, in terms of ships and other things like that. It became better to oversee things, and that's when we actually saw a revival of empires and more centralized kingdoms, and that's when we saw, the divine rights of kings and the concept of absolutism gaining power. So, I, Europe has, for Europe, it was never really efficient to have an empire until around, the Enlightenment era when the technology was available.
The sun will never set on the British Empire, and Netherlands sort of never. Netherlands at the time was the financial center of the world until when?
Um, I think it was mostly, I think we kind of declined in the late 19th century. But what really just kind of killed our power on the global stage was World War II. That's after World War II, we lost a lot of colonies. Our infrastructure was just completely demolished, and that's when we really just, yeah, it really just kind of went downwards for our country. I also think it's kind of, I'm not sure about this, but I think it was once the Dutch East India Company no longer had a monopoly granted by the government. Once the kind of the monopoly status expired, I think that's when um, a lot of more people were able to compete, and the Dutch East India Company kind of faltered, and that also kind of affected the global status of the Dutch.
Hmm, Dutch, the Dutch. Yeah, man, the Brit, sort of commercial power, commercial sea powers always have. It has a more interesting history than land powers, like let's say like France, Germany. Just it seemed like sea powers is able to acquire like a massive amount of influence all over the world, just the fact that they were able to control the seas.
Yeah, of
They're,
course, because they control the trade routes, and that causes much more connection and much more influence on a global stage, and more people are going to be involved in that, and that's going to be a lot more memorable in terms of history.
well, then again, the land power like Sparta defeated Athens, so then again, Sparta also declined too, more brutally than Athens, if you ask me. Let's see. It's sort of weird. It's sort of weird that land powers tend to be more centralized and despotic than sea powers. I wonder why.
I think this is just a completely wild theory that I just came up with, but maybe it's because land powers are much more interested in hoarding their wealth and influence, whereas the sea powers are much more likely to go global and to spread their wealth to trade. Maybe that's a possibility.
Yeah. Hmm. Hmm. Also, are you telling me that the after World War II colonialism ended? Because I have like a good authority on leftists that there's this thing called neo-colonialism, which is not really a thing, but eh,
Uh, the whole neo-colonialism is basically when an African country gets a McDonald's. That's neo-colonialism, or when you make a microaggression to a black person or something.
this imperial colonialists just
You know,
didn't let me
If
figure out leftist politics, but every day it gets more interesting if I understand where they're coming from.
well, in terms of at least the cultural left and the whole progressive woke mentality of the left. I don't think I will ever get that. But in terms of like the more economic centered left wing ideas, I find that a lot more interesting than the cultural aspects of the left.
Well, Marxism was, you know, been talking to a few anarchists on Twitter, Marxists, and they seem to kind of just want to, just accelerate society and um, kind of just want to see what a post-capital world will look like, and also fully automated electric communism is also being debated in the anarchist communities. A lot of them are takes a really environmental view on these systems. Like they think fully automated luxury communism, which is a meme, well, now taken serious as a political goal, will be really destructive ecologically. I find that to be interesting. Um, that means I have to look into Murray Bookchin eventually, who
Yeah,
who is not a communist, but a lot of their ideas comes from him.
I think I think a lot of the ideas of post capitalist luxury communism and things like that, I'll just call it kind of techno communism for now. I think a lot of those ideas rely a lot on the concept of post scarcity and having an abundance of resources, to the point where technology gets so advanced that um, capitalism as a system simply would simply not necessarily be defeated or evil, but simply how do you put it, obsolete. It simply, people simply wouldn't need it anymore, and I think that could only really be achieved in a post-scarcity society. And I'm kind of skeptical of whether or not such a society could even be able to be fulfilled. I think there's always going to be a distribution of property that needs to be allocated in a scarce manner. And even if um, even if tangible property um, becomes post-scarce, there are other forms of property, simply territory, for example, that also needs to be taken into consideration. So I think the ideas of luxury communism are, I think, a lot. Like, I think it's a bit too fictional for it to be realized.
Just, but no, just interesting. It's just interesting what type of analysis, well, what that type of extension you can derive from. Like, I'm more interested what they have to offer. Like I want them to under. I what I seek from them is to further my understanding of society. To be honest, and some some of it is kind of weird, like societies of control, like which can be traced back to Foucault, but it's just some of it is post ideological, some of it is pure ideology to borrow from Zizek, but it's interesting nonetheless.
Yeah, that's kind of the issue I have with a lot of these, specifically very socialist and communist minded people. They are always relying a lot on hypotheticals and on kind of societies that would exist in the future rather than something that we can kind of analyze right now. And it's also kind of the issue that I've always had with anarcho capitalism. These are simply ideologies that work on a strong moral premise, but kind of lack an empirical um, body to for me to really take serious. To be blunt on it, not that I don't find it interesting to read about, and that it's a an interesting possibility, for example. But if you can really envision it in an empirical manner and just kind of have to hope, that it could happen in the future, then it's hard for me to really be able to give even really an opinion on it. How am I supposed to know whether luxury communism would end up being a good system or a bad system if it's purely a hypothetical system that might or might not happen?
Oh, good thing for you. That's where that's where ideology comes in. We'll whisk you away to Candyland, and you know you could be there, you could live there. That's a wonderful thing. People enjoy ideologies, and I wish I can do Zizek voice because that would be really funny right now. But
Yeah,
anyway, let's see. Yes, don't really. Although, speaking of failed ideologies, do you still have any takes on proprietarianism since you sort of withdraw from that movement a couple months ago?
yeah. I think the ideas of proprietarianism are very. Um, I really like them. I really like the ideas of proprietarianism, and I still embrace a lot of the ideas and incorporate it into my um, kind of ideas of my views. So, for example, the concept of imposing costs, or how to suppress parasitism. Those are ideas that I still very much embrace. But the issue with the proprietarians is just it's more of an optics thing. It's more about simply the group itself just being yeah, it's the type of group that I don't really want to associate with, whether it's their kind of civil war larping or the fact that Kurt Doolittle tried to dox the distributists. Those are things that just go way too far for me, and that's kind of the reason why I distanced from them. But I do think that the ideas in proprietarianism have a lot of potential. I just kind of wish it could be realized under a different name, possibly.
You ever seen Jim Jesus' video critique of proprietarianism?
No, I haven't.
You should watch it just because A, it's really, really, really entertaining and funny, and B, just because it's just like it's just basically like Jim's be like, oh no, oh no, 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 that's not a good look. Like,
Is the critique more on like the actual group itself or the theories?
just the group itself, Mr. Doolittle, and at the and just like at some point, the best line from that video, you're just gonna be the best the best Presbyterian waiting for the Civil War at the deep fryer.
Yeah, it just kind of that's the thing that just annoys me so much about the proprietarians is that there are so many fascinating ideas in proprietarianism that draws on so many different theoretical sources. It really feels like a fully realized and more practical libertarianism, and it could really be used for a proper theoretical basis. But instead, they waste that on like Civil War talk. It's just such a shame.
Just, I think if you ask me, who follow Doolittle, I think it's just small in the grand scheme of things, to be honest. But it is what it is, I guess.
But I simply, because like I said, I find the ideas of proprietarianism interesting. So what I simply want to do is take a lot of the ideas, simply a lot of the elements of it, and kind of introduce it into more mainstream ideologies like conservatism and libertarianism, and maybe kind of spread the influence that way, without having it to be associated with a specific movement or label.
Hmm. Have you seen those debates that Trudeau Tom had with Doolittle?
I do remember a debate that Drew Dilton hosted between Doolittle and I think his name was Imperius or something.
I think
Imperium.
it's, yeah, that Imperious.
Yeah. Well,
There,
I, I, I vaguely remember that debate, but I think it was mostly just Imperius calling Doolittle an Anglo. So
they're say they're formalists. They're political formalists. That, in other words, they're absolutists. They take a more, let's say, more spiritual view of politics, a more esoteric view of politics than Kurt, who takes a more economic, materialist view of politics that epitomizing the social sciences as his backbone, while Dill Tom and Friends takes a more human look at it. You know,
that's actually been one of the things that I specifically have had disagreements with pragmatic culture because pragmatic culture is very metaphysical and I am very empirical. So those are two those are two very, of course, very different approaches and perspectives to politics that I'd like to, discuss with pragmatic culture, possibly in the future. But yeah, I that's also a reason why I was kind of drawn into proprietarianism because proprietarianism is just very empirical, and I have always been very empirically minded. I think
then you're Anglo at heart.
I
Although,
am, well, I am a core European, as you could call it.
uh, how would you describe me? Would you describe I'm more metaphysical or more, I don't know, more empirical minded?
I do think you're a lot more data driven, from what I've seen, at least, in the books that you read. You seem a lot more focused on kind of the real politics of things.
Okay, just Machiavellian, I guess.
Yeah, maybe you do kind of the geopolitics that you talk about do seem to be a lot about kind of this Machiavellian realpolitik idea, or it sounds very negative, but you could also just call it kind of pragmatism.
Yeah, just, just since I'm about to end this, and you want to do another good 20 minutes?
How long have we been using? How
Uh,
long have we been streaming?
about an hour and 40 minutes.
Um, don't mind another 20 minutes if you have other topics to talk
Um,
about. But if you feel like this was enough, then we can kind of end it.
just want to kind of reach the conclusion, or the conclusion of it, since we kind of have this Hegelian dialectic, antithesis, and dang, I messed that up. But never mind. But
Thesis
just want
and
to kind of reach,
antithesis.
but I kind of want to reach the conclusion of this. Let's bring it back to the main topic: Fukuyama and Huntington. Like, who you said is more correct in their analysis. What would happen in the 21st century, since they were kind of outlining what would have happened, but they were still analyzing the threats to democracies. And which do you think was more, which is, which of the two you can describe more as a prophet, anything else, who was right in the end?
Well, I think if you simply look at the current politics and the current situation, then you could pretty much say that Samuel Huntington was pretty much on the mark. I think the predictions he has made back then, almost the accuracy of the predictions that Huntington made was scary, to say at least. I mean, it was almost prophetic in many ways. Because all of this, ISIS, Boko Haram, the 9/11, Huntington wrote all about this before all those events happened, before all those groups were made. Huntington predicted pretty much all of this, and not only that, but he also predicted the rise of China. He predicted, other regions asserting their own culture. So I think in terms of predictions, what have currently happened, I think Huntington was way more accurate than Fukuyama. But Fukuyama also argued in his book that simply a rise of totalitarianism or threat to democracy doesn't necessarily debunk his idea that um, democracy would be the end of history, because he views it as a kind of a long-term thing. That's democracy or liberal democracy would always kind of win in the long term, even if it has setbacks. So I think a lot of the predictions of Fukuyama in his defense are a lot more long term, and we still have to kind of wait to see whether he will be correct. But I think with the course that we are going now, I think that Huntington is much more on the mark.
Again, it's my view because I'm more interested in the pessimism of Fukuyama, like almost like being a contrarian about the optimism that Fukuyama presented. But it's really the implications is actually Fukuyama's implications are actually quite more apocalyptic and scary at the end because the end of history, the whole title of the book is the end of history and the last man, like borrowing from Nietzsche, that phrase, the last man. And I think internally we're seeing the last man, the era of the last man in democracies. Like, for example, this really therapeutic turn in our institutions, especially in our educational institutions in America, like facilitating this almost like facilitating decline of mental fortitude on some basis, or basically the rise of identities, like just these marginalized identities, um, bas- basically justifying libertinism on some extent, but it's it's more so just examining what will happen, what could go wrong within liberal democracy, as he put it, the last man. Since the last man in Nietzsche terminology means that he's basically a man that enjoys the comforts, the appetites of the world, that they're just endlessly pursuing just consumerism, like they have no real purpose. Like in the end, he's almost the ultimate nihilist. And I think liberal democracy in the end has produced this kind of man, like this produced this content, while Fukuyama almost suggests there was almost a struggle, a glory with the struggle with communism during the 20th century. And now we have no monsters to destroy, so to speak, if if we take the view that these authoritarian powers may be rising, but they may also crash within a few years, such as Russia and China. That's my view.
Yeah, so just to kind of sum up this idea is basically that once there are basically no more enemies of liberal democracy, and once it has kind of established in the world, then people will kind of become complacent, become kind of slaves of consumerism and devolve into the last man. That's what I'm kind of getting from this idea.
Yes, exactly. You That's is way more articulate and cut straight to the point. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a very interesting.
Was
It's a
I
very.
inarticulate? Like, was I rambling?
Oh no, no, I think you explained it in in quite a detail. I kind of wanted to shorten it
Yeah,
so I could understand it.
yeah.
But yeah, yeah, I think that's a very interesting perspective on Fukuyama, and because a lot of people often very much focus on the idea of a end of history liberalism as being a positive thing, and that's often how they interpret Fukuyama. And I find this kind of pessimistic approach to Fukuyama to be a lot more interesting, and has a lot more interesting implications for the future.
Actually, really like terrible, terrible implications. Like,
Yeah, yeah. but a lot more food for thought.
Yes. Also, just men, the last man enjoying the big shopping mall of the world, and
Yeah, you remember that scene in Wall-E where you had all these fat people in jumpsuits and they in these electric chairs just watching a monitor right in front of their eyes. That's kind of the future, what we could expect if Fukuyama ends up being right.
you ever seen Gattaca? Yeah.
Uh, I haven't, no.
Oh, I think the future is probably. I think Wally is the worst case scenario, but Gattaca is like the best case scenario. Basically, it's basically what's his name? Ethan Hawke is in the movie. He's the lead, and basically they kind of have these designer babies, like where you can edit the genes of that babies in the future. And since he was like a miracle baby, he has a heart problem. So, in other words, in other words, I'm trying to say in that society, I think they practice soft eugenics. Like, really, I think that's the future is going to hold in the next maybe 40, 45 years, practicing eugenics.
Yeah, I actually kind of touched on that back in the stream when I talked about gene editing and CRISPR technology. I do think soft and voluntary soft and voluntary eugenics are going to very much define which nations gain power or not.
Uh, which is honestly quite terrifying. But he's either
Yeah,
Gattaca or Wally. I hope it's Gattaca.
yeah, of course, it all depends on whether or not Fukuyama is right on his analysis of liberalism, of course. But would that if that course would go, then yeah, there are quite a lot of fictions that we could compare it to, probably.
Mm, so yeah. So thanks for coming on, Michelle Caitlin.
No problem.
Been
I really enjoyed this discussion.
a good conversation, and I hope everybody enjoy your good weekend. You have a good night.